All right. Today we're diving into a pretty wide-ranging interview with JD Vance, which was actually conducted from inside the White House. We're going to break down all his key arguments, and believe me, they go everywhere. From fatherhood and fraud, all the way to a surprising take on UFOs. So let's get right into it.
You know, this idea right here, it really frames the entire conversation. Vance kicks things off by talking about his growing family, and he positions being a father as more than just a personal joy. For him, it's the core reason for his entire political worldview. It's what drives him to tackle what he sees as America's biggest challenges.
So yeah, let's start right there. The first big theme is how he connects the dots between his personal responsibilities as a dad and his public policy goals. He really pushes back on that old idea that having kids can hold back your career. Actually, he says it 10x's your career and your motivation. For him, wanting to build a better country for his kids is the ultimate driver. It's what turns these abstract policy debates into a deeply, deeply personal mission.
And that personal mission? Well, it pivots very quickly to what he identifies as the #1 threat to America's future, what he calls a systemic, multi-front war on fraud.
And what's really interesting here is just how wide a net he casts. He isn't just talking about one little thing. He brings up very specific examples, everything from alleged Medicaid fraud in Minnesota's Somali community to hospice fraud and voter fraud out in California, which he ties directly to the lack of voter ID laws. He paints a picture of a problem that's everywhere, touching all kinds of different systems.
And then he drops a pretty specific number. Vance claims that, as a matter of policy, the government right now just doesn't prosecute fraud cases that are worth less than $1.5 million. That's a threshold, he says, would be gone under his administration, arguing that you've got to pursue the smaller cases to uncover the really big conspiracies.
This quote really shows you just how seriously he views this whole issue. He argues that if this level of fraud is just left to run wild, it will literally bankrupt the nation and make everything that makes America great just disappear. So for him, this isn't some minor problem. It's a full-blown existential threat.
He also gets pretty specific about the legal tools he'd use, especially when it comes to immigration. He brings up the allegations against Representative Ilhan Omar and calls her actions a denaturalization offense. Now, that's a legal term for an act so serious it could actually warrant revoking someone's citizenship. That's the kind of enforcement he's suggesting is on the table.
So if fraud is the disease, then what's the cure? Well, this brings us to the solutions he's proposing, which really center on aggressive enforcement, big legislative action, and of course, securing the southern border.
Now, to get his agenda passed, Vance makes a pretty blunt case for getting rid of the Senate filibuster. His logic kind of follows 3 steps. First, he points out that the Democrats who defended the filibuster, people like Sinema and Manchin, were basically pushed out of their own party. Second, he argues this proves that Democrats will absolutely break it the second they get power again. So he says that leads to the only logical conclusion: Republicans have to break it now to pass their own priorities.
When he's challenged on whether his administration would deport more people than the Obama administration, Vance draws a really sharp line in the sand. He claims that under Obama, just turning someone away at the border got counted as a deportation. He says the focus would shift completely to what he calls interior deportations, which means removing people who are already living inside the country.
And the scale of that challenge, as he sees it, is just massive. He estimates there are 20 million criminal illegal aliens in the United States right now. He's framing the task as this monumental effort that would require years of sustained action and a Congress that's willing to cooperate.
Okay, next, he connects these huge policy issues directly to something everyone feels: your wallet. He argues that things like fraud and what's happening at the border are a major reason why the cost of living keeps going up.
He breaks it down into 3 key areas. When it comes to housing, he says the problem is just simple supply and demand. Too many people coming in and not enough homes being built. For food, he argues that when a huge population is getting welfare benefits, it drives up demand and, in turn, grocery prices for everyone who is paying. And in healthcare, he points to emergency rooms getting strained by non-English speakers, which he says adds costs and makes wait times longer for everybody.
To really drive his point home, he paints a stark economic contrast. He cites this specific data point. Under President Biden, he says, the average American's take-home pay went down by $3,000. But under President Trump, it went up by $1,400. This is really the core of his economic message, framing it as a choice between financial progress and financial decline.
All right, so just when you think you know exactly where this interview is headed, it takes a hard left turn. And I mean a really hard left turn, into the final theme, the supernatural.
The interviewer suddenly switches gears and asks about declassifying UFO files. Vance lights up, says he's personally obsessed with the topic and that he's determined to get to the bottom of it. He even says he wants to visit Area 51. But his theory on what they might actually find there is, well, it's pretty unconventional.
So he kind of throws out the whole popular idea of extraterrestrial aliens. Instead, he comes at this whole phenomenon from a theological point of view. When he hears about these unexplained otherworldly events, his mind immediately goes to a Christian framework of good and evil. He sees these beings not as visitors from another planet, but as something else entirely.
And that all leads to this final, provocative thought, maybe the most memorable line of the entire interview. It's a really surprising takeaway, right? It connects national policy all the way to paranormal theology. I guess the question it leaves you with isn't just what's in the UFO files, but how might a worldview that includes demons shape the leadership of a country? Definitely something to think about.